بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين. طيب, we have finished most of the sections of Tahara. We have only a few more, and today inshallah we're going to start with Al-Hayd, or menstrual bleeding. Now, on this level, the fiqh of Hayd could be considered rather easy. There's a large difference in the difficulty of learning something and the difficulty of doing ijtihad in something. Al-Hayd, menstrual bleeding, is one of the hardest chapters for the mujtahid specifically, not the alim, not the one who's learning, not the muta'allim, but rather for the mujtahid who's trying to reach a position on a certain thing. In menstruation, it could be one of the most difficult chapters due to the large amount of what appears to be contradicting a hadith from the Sahaba. And this happened to the extent that many of the opponents of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah used to curse us by calling us the scholars of Al-Hayd. The Mu'tazila used to say to Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu that most of his knowledge does not exit the pants of a woman, meaning he would spend most of his time looking at issues such as menstrual bleeding, postpartum bleeding, istinja and istijmar, cleaning up after the bathroom, and these types of issues. And it's a shame that some people from the deviant groups used to attack the scholars of such reasons. A reason such as studying the Sunnah correctly to make sure that you are reaching a correct position such that the women of Islam can, can do their ibadah properly. Similarly, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal spent over a decade trying to narrow down his opinion on Al-Hayd. And he said it's one of the most hardest things he had encountered. And just like the Mu'tazila cursed Abu Hanifa, they also cursed Al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhum after them. With phrases of similar meanings. At the end, this is a beginner text. We're only going to go into the basics rather than the advanced parts of this chapter, let alone going into the evidences and what the mujtahideen would have had to go into themselves. Like, there are some important things to learn, to know, or to keep in mind before going into this chapter. For people studying fiqh in general, and also for people studying the Maliki madhab in specific. And the reason is, we went into this before in the chapter of, I think, the nullifiers of wudu. I'm not sure. But we talked about the difference about how a faqih might describe something and how a scientist might describe something. There's a word we have right now, menstruation. The faqih is going to use that word to describe a specific topic, a specific concept. And the modern day scientist or biologist is going to also use that word and describe a specific concept. Just because they're talking about roughly the same thing, it does not mean that they're both talking about the same concept. So when a alim, a faqih, defines what menstruation is, he's going to include some things in the overall definition that a scientist is not going to include, and vice versa. The scientist is going to include specific instances that a faqih is not going to include. Even though they would agree on the majority of the instances in which they talk about, even if it's 95%, let's say. The second thing to keep in mind is that menstruation has two main important applications in the Sharia. The first one is for tahara, which is what we're going to go into now. To know, so the woman can know when she can pray, when she can't pray, when she can fast, when she can't fast, etc. The second important topic is in family law, because menstrual bleeding has a huge role to play in knowing how long the iddah is, knowing how long the period of waiting after divorce or after a past husband or after in many other instances, which I'm not gonna go into the details right now, but it has an application. And that second application in family law is usually for the purpose of knowing that the womb is empty and that she is not pregnant. In menstruation for tahara, it has a completely different concept. Not completely different, but slightly different. And you're going to notice this as soon as I start reading. Because for the purposes of ibadah, not for the purposes of family law, for the purposes of ibadah, a pregnant woman can be considered menstruating. Even though almost all scientists will tell you this is not possible. And they're incorrect. And we can talk about this at the end of class. But these are the two things to keep in mind before we go in. First of all, that for the menstruation is different in the concept of fiqh versus outside of fiqh, and also even within fiqh, when we talk about it for the purposes of worship versus for the purposes of family law, it has a different meaning, it has a different time limit, it has a different application, it's a different concept. So let's not oversimplify things when we go into fiqh, and always understand that words have slightly different meanings when we talk about it from an Islamic perspective versus a normal day-to-day conversational perspective. But I'll keep some questions for the end. I'm sure there's going to be a long discussion about this. But anyways, we will begin right now. فصل بالحيض والنساء مبتدئة ومعتادة وحامل. So women, for the purposes of tahara, or for the purposes of menstruation, are divided into three main categories. Mubtadi'a, a beginner, someone who hasn't had hayd yet, it's her first time bleeding. Wa mu'tada, so someone who is normal, someone who has done it before, and a hamil, a pregnant woman. And it's divided into three categories because the minimum and maximum time frame for these three categories differs. And we're going to get into that. وأكثر الحيض للمبتدئة 15 يوما. So we're talking about al-mubtadi'ah first. The first timer, a young woman who has just done it for the first time. How does she know when it has stopped and when it has began? So the maximum for a mubtadi'ah is 15 days. Similarly, the minimum for a tuhur or a period in which she's not bleeding is 15 days. And, 2 and 2 together, it's supposed to be a month in total, more or less, depending on the health of the woman and the many different variables that go into determining how long it lasts. So someone who has started to bleed, a woman who has started to bleed for the first time, if she bleeds on the first day, and the second day, and the third day, up to the 15th day, that is considered menstrual bleeding. On the 16th day, it's no longer considered menstrual bleeding. It's considered istihada, which is blood that is leaving for a different reason, an illness or something wrong in the system. So if the first timer is bleeding for 15 days, and on the 16th day she is still bleeding, then she does not count the 16th day. She makes the ghusl that is necessary for her, and she can pray and fast, etc., and she can read Quran. And she does not consider herself bleeding after the 16th day or after the 15th day. So 16 and onward, that's considered istihada or unnatural bleeding due to an illness or something. Like, what if on the first time she only bled for 3 days? Then okay, she bled for 3 days, and on the 4th day she stopped. On the 4th day she does also, and she continues with her life. She prays and she fasts, and she does what other women would do. Now, after she's finished the first time, she's considered a mu'tada. Someone who has a aada, she has a habit or a normal period of time. Like, what happens on the second month? On the second month, if she her cycle starts, now she has a aada. The first time she did it, it was 3 days. Now it's her second time. This 3 day period is called aada, a normal period of time, not the what what people would call the cycle itself. People call the cycle itself the period. So I'm not referring to that. I'm talking about the period of time, which is 3 days, which she has had played. That's her aada. That's her normal period of time. So someone who is a mu'tada, what does she do? A mu'tada has a maximum period of time. That's different from a beginner. We said the beginner, the maximum period of time is 15 days. A mu'tada is different. The default for a mu'tada is that every cycle after that, because generally speaking for women, the amount of time is usually the same in every cycle. It does not change in an extreme amount constantly. So if someone were to do it for 3 days in this month, the next month, it is usually expected that it's also going to be 3 days. That's why it's called aada, a normal habit. Like, if she bleeds for 3 days, and then on the fourth day again, then she adds the fourth day. And her new habit becomes 4 days. If she bleeds on the fifth day, then she adds the fifth day, and the new habit becomes 5 days. If she bleeds on the sixth day, then her new habit is 6 days. However, if she bleeds on the seventh day, that is no longer considered menstrual bleeding, it's considered istihala. Like, why is that? What the mu'tada does, the mu'tada uses her aada, her normal time frame, as a baseline. And every time she enters a new cycle, her new cycle is that time frame plus 3 days. This is called istibhar. This act of adding 3 days is called istibhar. So if someone's normal habit is 2 days, then the maximum for the next month is 5. If her normal habit is 11 days, then the maximum for the next month is 14. However, we said that 15 is the maximum. So if someone's habit is 14 days, and the next month she bleeds for 14 days and then another 3, when does she make ghusl? Someone want to try and answer? If her habit is 14 days and the next month she bleeds for 17, what's her new habit? Is it 17 or is it something else? Because 17 is 3 days plus her habit. We said that's the rule. No one's trying to answer? Like, because the maximum is 15 days, still 15, yes. No, it's not 14 or 15, it's 15. So she can add 3 days, she can do a istibhar of up to 3 days every time until it gets to 15. 15 is the maximum. So even if there's 14 plus 3, 17, 15 is the maximum. She can add that one day, but the other 2 days are considered istihada. They're considered unnatural bleeding. And she can, she does also on the 15th day regardless, and she can read Quran and pray and fast, etc. That's istibhar. That's the concept of adding 3 days to the normal habit. Wait, what's the minimum? The minimum amount in worship is different than in family law. In family law, it is much longer because there's more at stake, and so the time period is longer. However, in worship, for the sake of worship, It is simply dufqa, one, as they say, burst, or one, flow. So it could last for two minutes, 3 minutes, or even an hour, let's say an hour, 2 hours. The minimum is however long it lasts. So if a beginner were to bleed for 1 hour and then it would stop, then she does ghusl after that 1 hour and she continues. What about a mu'tada? Mu'tada has a habit, which is, let's say for this specific woman, is 4 days. If she stops bleeding on the second day, she doesn't have to finish her habit. But the habit, the 'ada, is for knowing the maximum, not the minimum. So a woman who has a 'ada of 4 days, if she stops bleeding on after the second day, then she washes on the third day and the fourth day, and she doesn't count those 2 days as menstrual bleeding because the bleeding has stopped. So the 'ada is used for maximum. This same woman, if she bled for 4 days and then another 2, we know that we know she can add those 2 and they can equal 6 because it has not exceeded 3 from her 'ada. So we know the 'ada, so with that we can know the maximum. However, the minimum is however long it takes. Even if her normal habit is 15 days of bleeding, if she stops bleeding on the first day, then that's it. She can wash on the second day and she doesn't have to continue those 14 days because she stopped bleeding. So she can pray and fast and read Quran, etc. طيب. I'm sure there's going to be more questions at the end, but just so we can get through the basics. طيب. We said وأكثر الحيض للمبتدئة 15 يوما وللمعتادة عادتها فإن تمادى بها الدم زادت 3 أيام ما لم تجاوز 15 يوما. So the mu'tada adds 3 days as long as she does not exceed 15. وللحامل. So now we're to the pregnant woman. وللحامل بعد 3 أشهر 15 يوما. So a pregnant woman can be a beginner or a mu'tada, right? She can enter the pregnancy having not bled before, or she can have a 'ada, she can bleed before. The first 3 months of the pregnancy, we treat her as a normal woman. If she's a mubtadi'ah, we treat her menstruation as a mubtadi'ah, and if she's a mu'tada, we treat her as a mu'tada. What happens after 3 months? After 3 months, بعد 3 أشهر 15 يوما. After 3 months, the maximum becomes 15 days, regardless of her habit or anything. If she's pregnant for 3 months, the maximum becomes 15 days. وبعد 6 أشهر 20. After 6 months of pregnancy, it becomes 20 days. That's the maximum. فإن تقطعت, so that's the maximum for a pregnant woman, which is different than a normal woman. And now, فإن تقطع الدم. This is a new thing we have to discuss. What happens if the bleeding stops and then restarts? I mentioned in the beginning that the tuhur, the period in which there is no bleeding, has a minimum of 15 days. So what if she stops bleeding? Let's say she has a 'ada of 2 days. She bleeds for 2 days, and then she has 10 days of no bleeding, and then she starts bleeding again. She hasn't finished 15 days. She hasn't finished the minimum period of the tuhur. So what do we do? Because she hasn't finished the minimum period, which is 15 days, this new bleeding, we consider it part of the first haida. We consider it part of the original haida because the tuhur has not been completed. The 15 days has not been completed. So if she bleeds for 2 days and then doesn't for 10, and then bleeds again on the 13th day. So 2, 10, and then the 13th day she starts bleeding again. فإن تقطع الدم لفقت. She does تلفيق. She adds the new day. This 13th day is now counted from the original hayd, from the original menstrual cycle. So now we're at 3 days. Remember, we said that al-mu'tada, she adds 3 days to her habit maximum. So in this scenario, we said her habit is 2 days. So what's the maximum? 5. So if she bleeds for 2 days and then has no bleeding for 10, as we mentioned, and then she bleeds again on the 13th, so we had 2 original days, 13th, 14th, and then the 15th day. And she continues on the 16th day. We don't count the 16th day because the 2 original and the 3 ones after the 10 days add up to habit plus 3, which is 5. Another similar scenario, just so we can imagine this properly. If her habit is 6 days, what's the maximum for this month? It's 9 because it's her habit plus 3. So the maximum for this cycle is 9 days. Like she bleeds for 6 days, her habit, and then she has 4 days of no bleeding for a total of 10. And then she bleeds on the 11th day. The 11th day is now the 7th day, because we said there's 6 original days of bleeding, and now there's a new one. So that becomes the 7th day, even after 4 days of no bleeding. And then another day, that becomes the 8th day, and then another day that becomes the 9th. Now we have 6 plus 3, that's the maximum, even though it is disconnected. As long as it was not separated by 15 days of no bleeding, we consider it the same cycle. So we have 9 days now. 6, and then 4 no bleeding, and then another 3. What happens if she continues bleeding on the 4th day? We consider it istihada, because she has finished her habit plus 3. She has finished 6 plus 3. Anything after that, we said, is istihada. So the fact that it's disconnected doesn't change this rule. In those days in which she is not bleeding, what does she do? She acts as if she is not bleeding. Even though she's not in tuhur, she's also not menstruating. So therefore, in those 4 days, so we said 6 and then 4, and then she continued bleeding again. In those 4 days in which there was no bleeding, it's obligatory for her to do ghusl and to pray and to fast if it's Ramadan, if she has an obligatory fast. Otherwise, it's simply permissible, but the prayer remains obligatory. So those 4 days any day in which she is not bleeding, it's obligatory for her to do what a person who's not bleeding would do, even if she has not finished 15 days of tuhur and she will continue bleeding. So we gave an example of a disconnected cycle for the mu'tada, someone who has a habit. What if she is a beginner? What if it's her first time bleeding? Similar concept, the exact same application. We said that the maximum for a first timer is a 15-day period. So if she has 10 days of bleeding, and then 3 days of no bleeding, and then 10 days of bleeding, who's going to tell me on what day she does ghusl? Yalla, show me guys, you guys are paying attention. She has 10 days of bleeding. What did I say? 3? 10 days of bleeding, 3 days of no bleeding, and then another 10 days of bleeding. On what day does she make ghusl? So for a total of 23 days, on what day does she make ghusl? On what day is her cycle considered finished and she can and her tuhur has began. Day 18. طيب. Day 18 is correct. Because 10 plus 3 plus 5. The 3 is the disconnector, but the 10 and the 5 are the original days. 10 and 5 makes 15, the maximum for the mubtadi'ah, and the 3 is in the middle disconnecting them. But because the 3 is not a full tuhur, it does not, the 10 and the 5 are considered part of the same cycle. Like, Ahmed, I'll ask you later the methodology you reach so I can make sure the idea gets across. Like, now we're going to just quickly list the things that are impermissible for a ha'id, someone who is bleeding. ولا يحل للحائض صلاة ولا صوم ولا طواف ولا مس مصحف ولا دخول مسجد وعليها قضاء الصوم دون الصلاة وقراءتها جائزة ولا يحل لزوجها فرجها وما بين سرتها وركبتها حتى تغتسل. So it's not permissible for her to fast or pray or do tawaf or touch the mushaf, similar to, so she can read, but she cannot touch the mushaf, similar to someone who does not have wudu, nor enter the masjid, similar to the junub. They cannot enter the masjid even if they're just passing by. And she has to make up the fast that she missed. However, she does not have to make up the prayer. And وَقِرَأَتُهَا جَائِزَةٌ, her reading, her tilawa is permissible, as opposed to touching the mushaf. And it's not permissible for her husband to have intercourse with her or do anything between the knee and the surah, the belly button, or midriff, whatever the formal term for it is. And the reason for this is whatever leads to haram is haram, and therefore anything that is near intercourse would lead to intercourse and therefore is haram as well. So it's impermissible for intercourse and any action between the knees and the midriff. Everything else is permissible. Now the Maliki, as opposed to some other fuqaha, they do not place a kafara or an expiation for the man who does have intercourse with his wife during bleeding. There is some ahadith that say that you would pay an amount of money to charity if you do this action. However, Imam Malik rahimahullah saw that this hadith was very weak and not strong enough to build a ruling upon, and therefore there is no kafara or expiation. Rather, what is required of him is to simply make excessive istighfar, to seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the, again, very, very introductory, just introduction to al-hayd. There's a lot more that goes into this. Some of you guys may have heard of Sheikh Mahmoud Effendi in Istanbul, rahimahullah. One of the madaris that is associated with his group and his jama'ah. I know a student who went there. They have an entire fiqh course. So in the madrasa, they have an entire curriculum, right? They have an entire fiqh course going on, and then they have an entire fiqh course specifically for menstruation. That's how difficult it is to fully comprehend the evidences for this and how the usul lead to specific rulings with these evidences that are very, that appear to have a lot of differences in the ahadith. Not just the ahadith from the Prophet ﷺ, but also the ahadith from the Sahaba, the fatawa from the Sahaba, especially the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. There's so much that goes into this. There's a lot of situations that could arise. And that's why the ulama spent a lot of time for this. And that's why we do not care about the insults that the Mu'tazila or the Jahmiyyah hurled at us for spending so much time for such chapters, even though they would consider it a waste of time. So we have a few minutes left. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. uh, anything related to anything that I've said since the beginning of class, now would be the time. Does everybody understand the math on how Muhammad got to the answer, which is day 18? Is anyone interested in going through that scenario again? Someone who didn't understand it, someone who still doesn't understand the concept of istidhar or talfiq, joining the disconnected hides. Or maybe you guys don't understand it, but you're not interested in asking because you're not a woman. So you think it doesn't apply to you. Can you go over it again, please? So you mentioned all of it. Would it be permissible for a woman to take medication to delay her menstruation? Um, Now, to be honest, I did read about this recently. For some reason, I can't remember. Uh, I honestly don't. I don't remember anything about the topic specifically, but it's mentioned. It's mentioned quite specifically in Sharh al-Saghir, so I can send it after class, inshallah. A quick recap. I understand how the 10 plus 3 plus 5 math play. Regardless of whether she's a mubtadi'ah or a mu'tada, the days that disconnect a cycle are considered void. They're considered, we imagine, as if they are not even there. If she has not completed a full 15-day cycle of no bleeding, then any bleeding that happens is considered part of the first cycle. Because two hayd cycles, two menstrual cycles must be separated by a tuhur, must be separated by a 15-day period of non-bleeding. If that condition is not met, then any bleeding that occurs is added to the first, and we treat them like we would treat them if they were not disconnected. The beginner has a maximum of 15 days, and the mu'tada has a maximum of her habit plus 3 days. And her habit is the most she has had in the past. If she had, one cycle of 3 days, and then another cycle of 3 days, and then another cycle of 4 days, the 4 days becomes her habit forever, even if it only happened once. Like, inshallah, we can have perhaps a separate session, maybe one day, in which we can go into the details of this, outside the scope of Al-Akhdari. But for now, I think there are no more questions. We'll see you all next time for An-Nifas, which is postpartum bleeding. Bleeding that happens after the delivery of a child. So if it exceeds the maximum, does that mean it's istibhar? Yes. If it exceeds the maximum, someone who has a habit, if she has bled once for 4 days, and that's the maximum she's ever bled, then if it ever exceeds that, it's called istibhar. And if it exceeds the habit plus the 3 days, that is istihada, unnatural bleeding. Inshallah, we'll begin with nifas next time, which is very similar to menstrual bleeding, very similar concepts. And then, inshallah, the class after that, we will go right into salah, which is the longer, more bulkier section of the text. See you all next time. Jazakumullah khairan for coming. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum.